Django 6 was released this week, and in this video we're going to look at the main changes that have been added to the framework. Now this is a major release, and one of the main changes is that Django now includes a built-in tasks framework, and that can allow you to run code outside of the normal HTTP request response process. As well as that, we also have HTML partial support, which works well with htmx, and we also have content security policy support built into the framework. And we'll look at that later in the video. And the final main change, as mentioned in the release notes, is the adoption of Python's modern email API. So let's dive in, and before we do, if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page, and if you want to learn more about building Django and HTMX applications, check out this Udemy course that we released recently, and thank you very much to everyone who has bought that. So let's get started, and I want to start with the new tasks framework that's built in. So let's go to this section on background tasks. So if you're not familiar with tasks, they are essentially actions that occur outside of the request response cycle. And you can use those to offload some work, such as sending emails or processing data to background workers. And the benefit of that is that when users send a request and they're waiting for a response, computationally intensive tasks like that, or tasks that rely on I/O, they can be offloaded. And the benefit of that is that tasks that might take a while to complete can be offloaded, and users can get a response much quicker while that task is occurring in the background. So for example, when a user registers to your application, a task might be triggered to send them a welcome email. So that's an action-based task. And you can also have scheduled tasks as well. For example, at midnight every day, you might want to run a report. And with Django, there are some packages that support this, and the most popular of these is 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁. Now what's coming to Django 6 at the moment is not a drop-in replacement for 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁 and other tools like that. What it provides is task definition, validation, queuing, and result handling. And the idea is to create a consistent API for creating and managing tasks in Django going forward. However, as it says here, the responsibility for running those tasks continues to belong to external worker processes. Now, what has been introduced here is a task decorator. So you can decorate a Python function or any callable with this task decorator. And then once you've defined the task, they can be enqueued using this function here. It's the .enqueue function. We're going to look at an example of this in a second, but you can also configure backends that are actually going to run the tasks in a worker process, and that is done using the tasks setting. That's the main changes at a high level, and we're going to look at those just now. Now, there are two built-in task backends in Django 6, but they are not designed for production use. We have the immediate backend, and that is going to execute tasks immediately rather than in the background, and that can be good for testing, for example. And we also have this dummy backend, which does not actually execute the enqueued tasks, and instead it just stores the tasks for later inspection. So both of these are not designed for production use, but they're designed to introduce this API and let you test it out using Django 6. And the idea is that other task backends such as 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁 and so on are going to implement this API and give you a common way of defining tasks in Django. So let's now look at an example of how we can use this. And I've got a super simple dummy application set up here with some fake orders. And what you can do for each order is generate an invoice by clicking this button. Now if we go to VS Code, we have a function here that's going to generate a very simple text invoice. And as I've noted here in the comment, this is not currently a task. It's currently performed as part of the request response cycle. And if we go to views.py in this application, you can see that we have this view called generate invoice. And what that's doing is calling that function and passing the order ID. We want to actually make that a background task. Now, the reason you might want to do this is because to create a PDF invoice in production, for example, you might be relying on PDF packages like ReportLab. And you also have file I/O going on, and it could take a little while to generate invoices, and you might want to also do that in bulk. That is all stuff that you should be doing potentially with a background task. And the reason for that is that when a user wants to generate the invoice, they probably don't want to be sitting around waiting for too long. So rather than waiting around, this can be offloaded to a task. The user then gets the response very quickly, and they can then receive the invoice potentially via email at a slightly later date. Now, I've introduced a little bit of latency here to make it look like this is actually doing some processing, but what we're going to do is go here, and when we click the generate invoice button, notice that it does take 3 seconds, and finally we get this invoice, or we get the page reloaded, and we now can download this invoice, and we have this super simple invoice here for the customer, who is called James Yellow. Now, we don't want James Yellow waiting for that length of time, so we're going to offload this to a background task using the new mechanics that has been introduced in Django 6. So let's go to tasks.py, and if we reference the documentation again, we're going to import this task decorator. So let's bring that in at the top here from Django.Tasks. This is a new module and we're importing the task decorator. And we can then decorate this function with the task decorator. So now that we have done that, what we can do is go back to views.py and we're going to find out that this no longer actually works. So let's go back to the user interface and we're going to go back to this page. And if I try and generate a new invoice, notice we get this exception. And the error message says that a task object is not callable. So this function that we have defined in tasks.py, previously we could call that, but we can no longer call it because we've used the task decorator. And when you do that, you can only actually execute this function using the tasks in queue method. So let's go back to views.py, and what we can do is we can add the .enqueue method. And again, the hope here is that this will introduce a common API for Django task execution. So we have a task here, and then to execute that, we call the enqueue method, and we can pass any parameters that we need or any arguments that we need to that task using the enqueue method. So if you're familiar with Celery, this is similar to calling the .delay method in order to trigger task execution. And as a side note, if you're in an async context, you can also call the aEnqueue method. That's the async version of this. We're not, so we're going to stick to enqueue. And if we go back to our application here, let's generate an invoice for ID number 2 here. When that's generating, you can see it's still taking that 3 seconds before we get the invoice. And this is actually being executed by that immediate backend that Django provides in the task framework. And again, if we go back to these built-in backends, this actually executes the task immediately. It doesn't do so in the background. So that provides no real benefit. It's just useful for testing and getting up to speed with the API. But actually it is not executing in a background task, so that still takes 3 seconds. We still get that latency there. So in order to avoid that, we need to have a task backend that actually provides a worker environment in which to execute the task. Now currently, because this is a new API, the only available backends are from a package called Django Tasks. So let's have a look at that just now, and actually the changes being merged into Django 6 are largely coming from this package. So let's go down to here and we can install Django Tasks, but if we go further down, notice that we set that setting here called Tasks, and we can change the backend here. We have an immediate backend that's been brought into Django, but there are some additional ones, for example a database backend which stores tasks in the database, and it can retrieve and execute them using a db worker management command. We also have an rq backend, and that means Redis queue, and that is a backend that can enqueue tasks using Redis queue via the Django rq package. So we're going to try this out with the database backend, but we do need to currently install Django Tasks as a separate package. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to go to the terminal here, and I'm using UV here, so we can run UV add Django Tasks. And that's going to add that to the environment. Once we've done that, we're going to go to settings.py because we need to amend installed apps. So let's go to the documentation for Django Tasks. If you want to use the database backend worker, you need to add this to installed apps here. And I don't think you need to add Django Tasks itself because a lot of that's now been merged into Django 6. But if I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments. Let's go back to installed apps, and at the bottom here, we're going to add Django Tasks backends database. Now, after we've done that, we can set up the tasks setting. So I'm going to do that just now, and we're going to set this to the database backend, and I'll do that just underneath the installed apps. That can be anywhere in settings.py. And finally, if we clear the terminal, we can use uv run manage.py migrate. So let's execute that command, and that will add the necessary tables to the database that Django Tasks needs for the database backend. Now, I've already run that, so you can actually see that there's no migrations to apply, but there are now tables in the database for Django Tasks. And we can show that very briefly by looking at SQLite here. And if we go to the Explorer and open this up, let me make this a little bit bigger here so we can see it. Notice at the bottom we have this table here, Django Tasks database db task result. So we're not going to look at that any further at the moment. I just want to try executing this. Now remember, we do need to start a worker process. So in order to run this db worker from Django Tasks, we can use that management command. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to run uv run manage.py db worker. And when we execute that, it's going to start that worker process, and that is going to then be listening for task execution or for tasks to be enqueued using that enqueue method. And it's then going to execute those tasks in the worker process. Now, if we go back to another terminal here and start up the Django server, now that we've added this database backend, we shouldn't need to make any changes in order to actually execute this task, now using the database backend provided by Django Tasks. So let's go back to our application here, And at the bottom, if we click Generate Invoice, notice that it's processing. And if we refresh the page, after 3 seconds, we can now download that. And presumably the user would get an email or something to notify them that the invoice is ready. But what I want to look at on the terminal, if we go back to VS Code, let's open up the DB worker terminal and notice that a task was running and a task had succeeded, and it was the generate invoice task. So you can see in the logs for this worker process that tasks with a given ID have been enqueued, they are running, and then you get the status of that task, whether it succeeds or fails at the end. Now over time, Django will hopefully get more task backends to make this new API compatible with additional packages like 𝗙𝗓 and 𝗬𝗓 and so on. But what it's doing at the moment is laying the groundwork for a consistent future API for creating and executing tasks regardless of the execution backend. Now, if you'd like a more comprehensive video on this tasks framework, let me know in the comments. There's a lot more we can do with it, and especially if we use Django Tasks and the database backend or the 𝗿𝗓 backend. But for now, that's going to be all. I'm going to go back to the release documentation for Django version 6, and as well as tasks, we also now have template partials in Django 6. And we already did a video on this, so I'll leave a link to that in the description and in the top comment. But basically this is allowing you to define what's called template partials, and it makes it easier to encapsulate and reuse named fragments within a template file. That's very useful for working with HTMX and similar packages. So if you want to know more about that, you can check out the video we've already done on that topic. Now, another big thing is content security policy support. That's now in Django 6. So this makes it easier to protect your web apps against content injection attacks, such as cross-site scripting. What it allows you to do is declare trusted sources of content, and it gives your browsers very strict rules about the scripts and the styles and the images and so on that it can actually load into your application. Now previously there was a Django CSP package, but now some of that functionality is coming to Django 6 directly. And there are different tools that are provided. Importantly, we have a content security policy middleware. Now basically, content security policy, it's a response header that is sent from your server to the browser, and it tells the browser about which kind of scripts and so on can be loaded. And this content security policy middleware that's been added is going to take care of adding that content security policy response header based on how you have set up the CSP in your application. Now we're going to look at a couple of simple examples here just to illustrate what this is. And if you want a more comprehensive video on CSP, let me know in the comments. One of the main things we can do here is set up a secure CSP setting, and that contains these directives that you can set to particular values to determine which sources you want to allow for things like JavaScript and images and styles and so on. Now the way that CSP works is that many of these directives have a fallback, and that fallback is often default source. So you can set the default source to whatever you want, and then if you want to override that for script tags, for example, you can then override it using the script source directive. And based on these settings, Django is going to produce a content security policy response header, and that will be set to a value such as this, as you can see below. So each directive contains a value, and directives are separated by semicolons. And we're going to look in this video at what a nonce is in the context of this. So let's get started with an example. So we're going to go to this how-to guide. And step number 1, if you want to enable CSP support in Django version 6, is to add this middleware to your middleware setting. So let's go back to settings.py, and I'm going to add this at the bottom of the middleware setting. So this is the new content security policy middleware. Once we've added that, we can go back here, and we can now define a secure CSP setting. Now to do that, we can import this CSP enum from django.utils.csp. So let's go back to settings.py, and right at the top here, I'm going to bring that in, and we can go to the bottom of the file, and the new setting is called secure CSP. Now that is going to be set to a dictionary, and each key in the dictionary is going to be a directive that you define for your CSP policy. Now let's start simple here with default source, and we can set that to csp.self. So let's go back here and set this up. Now this is known as a fetch directive, and we set it to self here, and what that is going to tell the browser is to load only resources that have the same origin as the document, unless we have more specific directives other than default source that can set a different policy for different resource types. Now at the bottom, I'm going to remove this DB worker from the tasks framework, and let's go back to the server here. Now what this means is that if you're including any scripts or styles or anything like that in your project, and they don't come from the same domain or the same origin as your source document, that's going to be disallowed on the browser. So you're essentially telling the browser from your server that you only want to allow things to be included from the same origin. Now, if I open up base.html in our project here, let's go to the head tag. And I'm going to add a script tag here, and this is a script that loads 𝗷𝗫𝗄𝗃 into a project. But notice the source here has an origin that is certainly not localhost. This is coming from a CDN, so it's not the same domain or the same origin as this document. Now, because we only have a single CSP rule here that specifies default source, that is what's going to be used when loading scripts. And we're going to find out that this is now disallowed if we go back to the browser. So let's go back to our application here, and I'm going to open up the developer tools. And on the network tab, we're going to see that when we refresh this page, notice that this is blocked. And if we go to the console here, you can see that loading this script is violating the CSP policy directive of default source as self. And note that the script source directive was not set, so the default source is used as a fallback. Now, if we go back to Django here and we remove this, let's go back to the page here, and when we refresh the page, it's going to be able to load that 𝗷𝗫𝗄𝗃, and that's because we don't have a policy that disallows this. Now, we're going to keep this around. The default source, that's the useful fallback that we have, and we want to make that quite restrictive, but we can override it for certain elements. So for example, for JavaScript sources, we can define a script source directive, and the values for this can determine where we allow the loading of JavaScript from. So for example, CSP.self, and that's going to allow you to include scripts that are actually contained on the same server. But as well as that, we might want to whitelist the CDN, and I'm just going to copy this in here. So that's cdn.jsdeliver.net. Now, because this is more specific, it's the script source directive directly for loading JavaScript. This is going to take precedence for that 𝗷𝗫𝗄𝗃 over the default source. So if we go back to our application, let's refresh this here, and notice that it's loaded fine. If we go back to the network tab, we have a 200 response here, and just to make sure that's not being loaded from the cache, we still get that 200 response. Now, if we go back to our settings here and we just removed the CDN, we're going to see that this fails even with the script source, because again, we're setting it to self, and that is a JavaScript file that's coming from a separate origin. So it's going to be blocked again, as you can see here. Now, there is a better way to allow these kind of files from external sources. And by better, I mean a slightly more secure option than just whitelisting an entire domain. What we can add here is a new setting, and that's csp.nonce. Now, this is a term that refers to a number that is used once, so it's generated on the server and sent back in the response, and the next time a request comes in, it's going to generate a new number. And the idea behind that is that attackers shouldn't be able to guess that number, and you can then add that same number to any script declarations that you have in your application, and similarly for inline styles and so on. And as long as these match up, then the browser should allow that content to be loaded. Now, if we go back to the documentation on how to use the CSP in Django 6, you can see this section on nonce config, and we're going to see how exactly it's used in a second, so let's keep going with this. We've already added this to our configuration. So by adding that to script source, what's going to happen here is that as well as allowing self-hosted scripts, we're also going to allow script tags that have that matching nonce attribute. Once we've done that, we have a new context processor that's been added to Django 6, and that is the CSP context processor. So let's copy this and go back to settings.py, and I'm going to find context processors, and we can add that to the list of context processors. Now, what that is actually going to do is it's going to add a value to every Django template in your project. That's the purpose of a context processor. And for each response, it's going to make the generated nonce value available using this CSP nonce context variable. And by making that available in the template, you can add the nonce attribute to style tags and script tags. And as long as this value matches what's in the response header, the browser is going to allow that content to be loaded. So let's copy this line of code and go back to our base template here. And to the 𝗷𝗫𝗄𝗃 script tag, we're going to add that nonce attribute. And we're going to set it to this new context variable that's going to be available, and that's the CSP nonce. Now, after doing that, let's go back to the application and refresh. And notice we can load the 𝗷𝗫𝗄𝗃 script tag because presumably the nonce is matching what's in the response header. So if we look at the response header here, let's go to the original response. Notice the content security policy, and you can see here we have this value here. This is randomly generated, and you can see it begins with QRO6. And if we look at the source for this page, notice that the same nonce has been added to the script tag, and because those match up, that tells the browser that this is secure, it's come from the server, and we can safely load this script. So again, the idea here is to make it as secure as possible and not allow random scripts to be loaded if your site is compromised and so on. And you can also apply this to style tags, to images, to fonts, and many more types of content. So that's been a little bit about CSP. This is now built into Django version 6. And there's so many other things you can do with this. For example, you could disallow your application from being used in an iframe. So there's a directive called frame ancestors for that. That can help prevent clickjacking. And you can also control images and fonts. You can control AJAX requests and fetch requests. And you can also control things like audio and video and so on. So if you'd like to see more on this, let me know in the comments. And just to finish this video off, I want to look at some of the other features that have been added to Django version 6. So we've covered two comprehensively, that's the tasks framework and the content security policy support. And in a previous video, we also looked at template partials. So I'll leave a link to that just below. What we also have in Django version 6 is the adoption of Python's modern email API. And this API is centered around an email message class, and that gives you a cleaner and Unicode-friendly interface for composing and sending emails. So that's a nice addition, but it's not something I'm going to demonstrate here. Let's now look at some of the minor features that have been added as well. So we now have a 𝗏𝗏 free icon set for the Django admin, so that's pretty cool. Another one I'm excited to use is in the Postgres package. We have a new 𝗦𝗵𝗽 expression, and this will help provide fine-grained control over search terms when you're doing full text search in your Postgres database. And if we scroll down here to the models section, some cool additions here. So for aggregate objects, you can now use an order by argument to specify the ordering of the elements in the result. And if we scroll down here for generated fields in Django, they are now refreshed from the database after save on backends that support the returning SQL clause. And that's most backends other than MariaDB and MySQL. So a generated field, we did do a video on this previously. It's a field that depends on other fields in the database. And now when you save a model, the generated field is going to update automatically. And we also have some new objects for pagination. We have an async paginator and an async page, and these provide async implementations for pagination. I think that's a pretty good addition as well. And there's some good additions for the new query string template tag. So that was introduced in version 5, and it's been improved a bit here in version 6. So if you'd like to see any videos on anything specific in that list of stuff, then let me know in the comments. That's been an overview of some of the main changes in Django 6. It's a good release, and I'm looking forward to using it in my applications. Now, if you found this content useful and you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page. And if you want to learn more about building Django apps, check out the course we released on Udemy on building hypermedia web applications. And other than that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon in the next video.